There is a particular cruelty in watching a hero fall, especially when his rise felt like history itself holding its breath. In one defining moment, King Juan Carlos I stood between a fragile democracy and the shadow of dictatorship, and for decades, Spain believed it had found its savior, a king who chose the people over power, a monarch who helped guide the nation out of the long night of Francoist Spain and into something freer, something modern. But history rarely stays that simple, because the same man who was lifted onto a pedestal by a single act would, years later, watch that image fracture under the weight of 5 scandals, each one chipping away at the myth, each one forcing a question Spain could no longer ignore. Was he ever the hero they believed in, or just a man who knew how to play the part when it mattered most? This is the story of that fall, of how a single moment built a legend and how everything that followed slowly tore it apart. Because to understand the collapse, you have to understand the height, how far he rose, how deeply Spain believed, and why, when the truth finally caught up, the fall felt not just inevitable, but deafening. Part 1: The Shadow of a Dictator. To understand Juan Carlos, you must first understand Francisco Franco, the man who made him and the man he was expected to become. Francisco Franco had ruled Spain since 1939, when his nationalist forces crushed the Spanish Republic in a civil war of appalling brutality. His regime was a peculiar thing, not quite Nazi Germany, not quite Mussolini's Italy, but something distinctly and suffocatingly Spanish in its conservatism. The Catholic Church sat at its right hand. Political dissent was punished with imprisonment, exile, and death. Regional languages and identities, Catalan, Basque, Galician, were suppressed with particular venom. Spain under Franco was to be one nation, one language, one faith, one leader. Everything else was silence. And yet even Franco understood that he would not live forever. By the 1960s, the aging dictator had begun to think about succession. He was a monarchist at heart, despite having kept the Spanish royal family in exile since the fall of Alfonso XIII. The Bourbon dynasty had a legitimate heir in Don Juan de Borbón, son of the last king. But Franco did not trust Don Juan. He was too liberal, too willing to flirt with democratic ideas, too independent for a man who had spent 3 decades deciding what independence was permitted and what was not. So Franco made a calculated move of breathtaking audacity. He bypassed the legitimate heir entirely and chose instead to groom the heir's own son, a young prince named Juan Carlos, personally and directly. It was an act of political engineering so brazen it almost demands admiration on a purely technical level. From the age of 10, Juan Carlos was brought to Spain and educated under Franco's watchful paternalistic eye. He attended Spanish military academies. He was introduced to the machinery of the Franco estate, introduced to the generals and the ministers and the bureaucrats who kept the whole apparatus humming. He was shaped, molded, and prepared to be not the liberator of Spain, but its faithful custodian, the man who would preserve everything Franco had built and carry it intact into the future. Or so Franco believed. In the royal households of Europe, they whispered about the Spanish prince with barely concealed pity. They called him Juan Carlos the Brief, certain that the democratic tide rising across the continent would sweep him away within months of taking the throne. Even within Spain, among those who dared whisper at all, the assumption was clear. This was Franco's puppet, wound up and ready to perform on command. Nobody, not the generals, not the Democrats, not the foreign governments watching nervously from across the Pyrenees, truly anticipated what Juan Carlos would do the moment the old dictator finally closed his eyes. Part 2: The Mask and the Miracle. Francisco Franco died on November 20th, 1975, after weeks of agonizing medical intervention that his doctors maintained and his nation endured with a mixture of ceremony and barely suppressed impatience. He was 82 years old. He had ruled Spain for 36 years. He died in his bed, which was more than many of his victims had managed. 2 days later, Juan Carlos I was proclaimed King of Spain. The world braced itself. Here, after all, was the man Franco had personally chosen. Here was the product of decades of Francoist education, surrounded by Francoist ministers, inheriting a Francoist state. The generals who had kept Spain in its long, suffocating grip were confident. The apparatus of repression remained intact. The structure was all in place. The machine would keep running. The new driver would know which pedals to press. And then Juan Carlos began, slowly, carefully, and with the instincts of a political genius disguised beneath the agreeable manner of a slightly bumbling aristocrat, to dismantle every single piece of it. The process was not fast. It could not be. A clumsy move, a single miscalculation, and the military would have had its excuse. The generals who had served under Franco were not decoration. They were real, they were armed, and they were watching. Juan Carlos understood this. He moved with the patience of a man playing chess against an opponent who doesn't yet realize the game has already been decided. He worked through the existing Francoist legal system to achieve democratic ends, a paradox so elegant it nearly defies belief. He appointed Adolfo Suarez, a reformist who had, crucially, worked within the system, as prime minister. He supported the legalization of political parties, including the Communist Party, a decision so explosive that it nearly caused the breakdown he had worked so hard to avoid. He presided over the drafting of the 1978 Constitution, which transformed Spain from a dictatorship into a parliamentary monarchy, with a king at its center, yes, but a king bound by the will of an elected parliament and the rights of his people. In less than 3 years, Juan Carlos had turned Franco's Spain into a democracy. And he had done it without a revolution, without mass violence, without the country tearing itself apart. Historians would come to call it la transición, the transition, and they would argue about its details and its necessary compromises for decades afterward. But the bare fact remained extraordinary, one of the most peaceful and successful transitions from authoritarianism to democracy in modern history, accomplished by a man everyone had assumed would do the opposite. He had fooled everyone. He had played the role of the loyal Francoist prince so convincingly that by the time anyone realized what he was actually doing, it was already done. Spain loved him for it. Of course it did. Part 3. The Night That Made a Legend. If the transition made Juan Carlos beloved, one single night made him a legend. February 23rd, 1981. In Spain, it is written simply as 23F, and every Spaniard of a certain age knows exactly what those numbers mean, the way Americans know November 22nd, the way a generation knows September 11th. Those numbers carry the compressed weight of a night when everything could have gone differently, when the fragile experiment of Spanish democracy came within a breath of ending before it had properly begun. Spain's young democracy was under enormous strain. The economy was struggling. ETA, the Basque separatist organization, was conducting a campaign of political violence that had claimed hundreds of lives. And within the military, the old Francoist guard, the men who had served the Generalissimo and who looked at this new, noisy, chaotic democracy with barely concealed contempt, were growing not just restless but dangerous. On the evening of February 23rd, the Spanish Parliament was in the middle of a vote to confirm a new prime minister. The chamber was full. Cameras were rolling. And then, with a violence that stunned the nation watching on their television sets at home, Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero burst through the great wooden doors of the Congress of Deputies with 200 armed civil guard officers at his back. He strode to the front of the chamber. He raised his pistol and fired at the ceiling. Todo el mundo al suelo, everyone on the floor. The coup had begun. In Valencia, a general named Milans del Bosch declared a state of emergency and ordered tanks into the streets of the city. In Madrid, conspirators were moving. The old guard was rising, and the conspirators believed they had been told or had convinced themselves that the king would support them. That when it came down to it, this son of the Francoist tradition, this man shaped and educated by the regime, would see which way the wind was blowing and stand with the men in uniform. They were so certain of this that they had not even bothered to secure his neutrality. They assumed it. They counted on it. They had catastrophically misread the man they thought they had made. Through the long hours of that terrifying night, Juan Carlos was on the telephone. He called general after general, captain general after captain general, working through his military contacts with the systematic precision of someone who had spent his entire life learning how the Spanish armed forces worked. He made clear, in terms that permitted absolutely no ambiguity, that he did not support the coup, that he considered it a betrayal, that any officer who joined it was committing treason, not just against the Constitution, but against the Crown itself, against him personally. And in the early hours of February 24th, he appeared on national television. He wore his military uniform, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the role that in this moment mattered more than any other title he carried. He looked directly into the camera. He stated, clearly and without hesitation, his absolute support for the democratic constitutional order. He ordered the military to stand down. By morning, it was over. Tejero surrendered. The tanks rolled back to their barracks. The coup collapsed like a house of cards the moment the wind changed direction, and the wind had changed because one man had decided which way to blow it. The scenes that followed were extraordinary. Millions of Spaniards poured into the streets across every city in the country in support of democracy, in support of their constitution, in support of their king. Approval ratings for the monarchy shot into the stratosphere. He was genuinely beloved. Not admired from a polite institutional distance, not respected in the careful way one respects a useful symbol, but loved with something approaching the passionate gratitude of people who had just watched their future nearly stolen from them and seen one man stand in the way. He was, in that moment, genuinely, deservedly a hero, and the tragedy of everything that came after cannot be separated from the height of that moment, because you can only fall from where you stand, and in February 1981, Juan Carlos I stood at the very summit of Spanish public life. Part 4. The Rot Beneath the Gilding. History is rarely kind enough to offer clean endings. Heroes, if they live long enough, have a way of complicating their own legacies. The heroic phase of Juan Carlos's story ended, more or less, with the defeat of the 1981 coup attempt. After that came the long middle period, the decades of his reign during which Spain grew, modernized, joined the European community, hosted the Barcelona Olympics, and became unmistakably a prosperous modern European democracy. The monarchy continued to be popular. Juan Carlos continued to be seen as a beloved national father figure, avuncular and approachable in a way that traditional European monarchies rarely managed. But beneath the surface, quietly and over many years, something was rotting. Spain in these boom decades, developed its own particular ecosystem of corruption, a web of relationships between politicians, businessmen, construction companies, and regional governments that had become one of the defining, if rarely discussed, features of the country's rapid modernization. Money moved through channels that were difficult to trace. Contracts were awarded to companies with the right connections. Favors were exchanged in the twilight between the legal and the merely unethical. It was a system visible, if you knew where to look, in almost every level of Spanish public life. The royal family was not immune. Juan Carlos, as a constitutional monarch, was supposed to exist above the daily transactionalism of economic life. His role was symbolic, ceremonial, diplomatic. He was not supposed to be a businessman, and yet questions began to accumulate, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. There were whispers about his relationships with certain Middle Eastern royal families, particularly the Saudi royal house. There were questions about the awarding of certain significant infrastructure contracts for a high-speed rail line between Medina and Mecca to Spanish companies. There were questions about whether those contracts had been facilitated by Juan Carlos's personal involvement and about what precisely he had received in return. There were questions about accounts in Switzerland, about foundations in foreign jurisdictions, about money that had moved through channels nobody seemed eager to explain clearly. These were not questions being asked loudly at first. In Spain, a certain deference to the monarchy had been baked into the cultural settlement of the transition. Criticizing the king felt, to many Spaniards, uncomfortably close to criticizing democracy itself. The two had become so identified with each other in the national imagination that attacking one seemed to threaten the other. The press was largely deferential. The political class was largely silent. The questions simmered quietly beneath the surface of public life, unasked and unanswered. But history has a way of forcing questions into the open, whether we are ready for them or not. And the force that finally cracked the surface of Spanish royal mythology was not a journalist or a judge or a political rival. It was an elephant. Part 5. The Elephant That Shook a Kingdom. April 2012. Spain is in the full, desperate grip of the Great Recession. The numbers tell part of the story, but numbers alone cannot capture what it felt like to live in Spain in those years. 24% unemployment, the highest in the European Union. Youth unemployment above 50%, meaning 1 in every 2 young Spaniards who wanted to work could not find a job. Families losing their homes to banks that had encouraged them to borrow more than they could possibly repay. The government implementing wave after wave of austerity cuts demanded by European creditors, cuts to hospitals, to schools, to the social services that people who had spent their entire working lives paying taxes had every reason to believe would be there when they needed them. People were frightened, people were angry, and they were watching, with an intensity that prosperity tends to dull, precisely how those at the top were behaving. This was the moment the photographs appeared. King Juan Carlos, 74 years old, had been in Botswana on an elephant hunting safari. He was photographed holding a high-caliber rifle. He was photographed grinning next to a dead elephant. He was photographed in the posture of a man for whom the cost of traveling to southern Africa to shoot one of the world's most magnificent and endangered animals is a trifle, a weekend distraction, a matter of such complete and obvious normalcy that it had apparently not occurred to him or to anyone around him that it might look bad. The photographs tore through Spanish social media with the velocity of something that had been waiting to explode. They spilled onto the front pages of every newspaper in Spain and most newspapers in Europe within hours. Here was the king, the symbol of national unity, the father of democracy, spending money on luxury hunting trips in Africa while his people could not afford their mortgage payments. Here was the man whose role was to embody the dignity and seriousness of the state, posing next to a dead elephant with the satisfied expression of someone who had suffered no crisis of conscience whatsoever. The details that emerged made it worse. The trip had not been cheap. The elephant hunting package alone reportedly cost tens of thousands of euros. He had traveled with companions. He had been enjoying himself thoroughly and without apparent concern, while the country he symbolized hemorrhaged through one of the worst economic catastrophes of its modern history. He had broken his hip during the trip, which was actually how the story broke. He had needed to be medevaced back to Spain, and the circumstances of his absence could no longer be kept quiet. He returned in a wheelchair, and the image of the wheelchair became its own kind of symbol. The man who had once faced down armed military officers, now being pushed through an airport, diminished, exposed, and unable to escape the scrutiny he had invited. He apologized. He appeared before cameras and said simply and quietly, "Lo siento mucho, me he equivocado, y no volverá a ocurrir." I am very sorry. I made a mistake and it will not happen again. It was the first time in the modern history of the Spanish monarchy that a king had publicly apologized for anything. A remarkable moment, in its way, a puncture in the smooth, impermeable surface of royal dignity. But it was not enough, because the elephant hunt, as shocking as it was, turned out to be almost the smallest piece of the problem. It was merely the crack through which the light got in, and once the light was in, there was no stopping what it illuminated. Part 6, The Family in the Dock. While the elephant photographs were still burning through public consciousness, an investigation was quietly moving through the Spanish judicial system that would prove far more consequential than any hunting trip. It concerned Iñaki Urdangarin, the king's son-in-law, husband of Princess Cristina, Juan Carlos's youngest daughter. Urdangarin was a former Olympic handball player, charming and well-connected, and he had used his connection to the royal family to build what investigators alleged was a systematic fraud operation. Through a charitable foundation called the Nos Institute, he was accused of billing regional government bodies for events and conferences at wildly inflated prices, pocketing the difference, and using the prestige of his royal connection to ensure the contracts kept flowing. The amounts involved ran into millions of euros. The scheme, investigators argued, had operated for years. The investigation eventually led to criminal charges, and then in a development that sent shockwaves through the Spanish establishment to something that would have seemed unthinkable even 5 years earlier, the indictment of Princess Cristina herself on charges of tax fraud and complicity in her husband's activities, a daughter of the king, at a criminal defense table. In a courtroom, Juan Carlos had built his entire legacy on the idea that the monarchy was the guarantor of constitutional order, the institution that stood above the grubby corruption of everyday political life, the one fixed point in a system where everything else was subject to human weakness and self-interest. And now his own daughter was in court on fraud charges. His son-in-law would be convicted and sentenced to 6 years in prison. The princess was eventually acquitted, but the months of proceedings, the testimony, the documents, the revelations about how the couple had actually lived, the parties and the properties and the offshore accounts had inflicted damage that no acquittal could fully repair. The monarchy's approval ratings collapsed. For the first time since the transition, polls showed a majority of Spaniards, not a small dissident minority but an actual majority, expressing serious doubts about whether Spain should continue to be a monarchy at all. The institution that Juan Carlos had built, that he had saved in 1981, that he had spent decades cultivating and protecting, was now in genuine existential danger, and he had brought it there himself. In June 2014, Juan Carlos I abdicated. His son Felipe VI ascended to the throne. The announcement was framed as a natural generational transition, a father clearing the way for a younger generation to carry Spain into its future. There was some truth in this, but there was also the undeniable reality that the father's presence had become a liability that the institution itself could no longer sustain. Part 7: The Exile of a Ghost. For a few years, abdication seemed to work. Felipe VI proved to be a serious and disciplined monarch. He was careful in his public statements, scrupulous about separating himself from his father's associates, and determined to reform the royal house's finances and governance. Slowly, with considerable effort, the monarchy's approval ratings began to recover. And then Juan Carlos, unable or unwilling to simply step back into the comfortable obscurity that the moment demanded, began to generate headlines again. The Swiss investigation moved forward. Swiss prosecutors, digging into financial flows through accounts in Geneva and elsewhere, found what they described as evidence of a 100 million euro commission payment transferred to Juan Carlos from a foundation controlled by the Saudi royal family around the time the Medina-Mecca rail contract was awarded to Spanish companies. The money had not been declared. It had moved through mechanisms designed to obscure its origin and destination. There were further accounts, further payments, further complications. Spanish prosecutors, initially limited in what they could investigate because, as a former King Juan Carlos enjoyed certain legal immunities, eventually found enough outside those immunities to open their own cases. The picture that emerged was of a man who had, over many years, accumulated enormous hidden wealth through his role as Spain's internationally connected head of state, using the access and the prestige that his people had granted him in exchange for what appeared to be very substantial private financial benefit. There was also Carina Zusine Wittgenstein, a German-Danish businesswoman who had been Juan Carlos's companion for years. She gave interviews, shocking, detailed, specific interviews, in which she described the former king's financial arrangements in terms that went far beyond what any official investigation had yet confirmed. She described him as someone who had treated his position as a license to enrich himself and those around him, operating with the casual confidence of a man who had genuinely never expected to be held accountable. In August 2020, Juan Carlos left Spain. He did not announce where he was going. He did not hold a press conference. He simply left, slipping away to the United Arab Emirates and then eventually to Portugal and elsewhere, conducting a kind of peripatetic exile while the investigations accumulated behind him. He left a letter to his son that spoke of his wish to avoid further damage to the institution of the monarchy. It was, in its way, a dignified document, but dignity is easier to perform on paper than to demonstrate through decades of behavior. The man who had saved Spanish democracy had fled Spain to avoid the consequences of how he had governed himself within it. Part 8. What it broke and what remains. Here is what the collapse of Juan Carlos's reputation actually cost. It cost the monarchy something that cannot be bought back with good conduct or favorable polling: the myth of its own necessity. During the transition and through the 1980s, the monarchy had a story to tell about itself, that it was the unique guarantor of Spain's democratic stability, the institution that stood between order and chaos, the one force that had proven definitively that it would protect the Constitution when the alternative was armed takeover. That story was true, and it was powerful, and it had done real work in building the legitimacy of the Spanish state. After Juan Carlos, that story could no longer be told in the same way, because the same man who had protected the Constitution had also, it turned out, been spending decades helping himself to money that wasn't his, living a private life that contradicted every value his public role was supposed to embody, and then running away when the bill came due. The heroism was real, and so was the corruption. The Spanish public was left with the uncomfortable, unresolvable task of holding both of these things about the same man simultaneously, and of deciding what they meant for an institution they had been told and had largely believed was indispensable. The effect on younger Spaniards was particularly acute and particularly lasting. For Spaniards who came of age during the austerity years, who grew up watching unemployment statistics that would have been unimaginable in any other context, who watched their parents lose jobs and homes, who themselves emigrated in search of work that didn't exist at home. The Juan Carlos revelations were not a complicated disappointment. They were a confirmation of something they had already begun to suspect, that the rules were different at the top, that the sacrifices demanded of ordinary people were not demanded of everyone equally, and that the institutions that lectured them about shared national values were sometimes run by people who did not themselves believe in those values at all. Republicanism in Spain, which had been a minority position through most of the post-transition period, associated in the public mind with the losing side of the Civil War, with bitterness and nostalgia and the dangerous reopening of wounds, became, in the wake of the Juan Carlos scandals, a respectable mainstream opinion. Not the majority opinion necessarily, but no longer the fringe. Surveys showed and continue to show that significant proportions of the Spanish public, particularly the young, would prefer a republic. This was a political reality that had not existed, or not in the same form, before the elephant photographs and the Swiss accounts and the midnight departure to Abu Dhabi. Felipe VI has done much and worked genuinely hard to repair this damage. He renounced his own inheritance from his father. He stripped his sister of her royal title following the Erding Arin conviction. He has governed with a seriousness and a care for institutional propriety that stands in deliberate contrast to his father's later years. The monarchy survives. Its approval ratings, while lower than in the golden years of Juan Carlos's post-coup peak, have stabilized. But survival is not the same as security, and the questions that hang over the Spanish monarchy today about its long-term future, about whether a generation raised on the Juan Carlos scandals will eventually decide, democratically and without drama, that they would prefer a different arrangement, are questions that a few decades of careful governance by Felipe VI may not be enough to settle permanently. There is a question that hangs over the entire story of Juan Carlos I, one that resists easy answers and rewards honest consideration. Was he a great man who became corrupt? Or was he always the kind of man who becomes corrupt, but circumstances first required him to be something greater? The instinct, when confronted with such a question about a figure whose heroism was real and documented and consequential, is to try to find a clean answer, to declare him either fundamentally noble or fundamentally venal, because holding both simultaneously is uncomfortable. We prefer our judgments to be simple. We prefer our heroes to stay heroes and our villains to stay villains, and we find it profoundly unsettling when the same person is undeniably and verifiably both. But the truth of Juan Carlos I refuses that comfort. He did save Spanish democracy. The 1981 coup would in all probability have succeeded without his intervention, and a democratic Spain that had barely existed for 3 years might easily have been snuffed out before it had the chance to become the prosperous, modern European society it eventually became. That matters. The lives it changed, the freedoms it protected, the trajectory it set, these are not nothing. They are, in fact, enormous. And he also took money he was not entitled to take. He also lived a private life that systematically contradicted his public role. He also ran away when the accounting came, rather than facing it. These things are also enormous, and they cannot be erased by the heroism that preceded them. Perhaps the most honest thing to say is this: Juan Carlos I was a man of extraordinary capability who was placed in a position of extraordinary privilege, and who discovered, over the long decades of unchecked power and deference and the particular intoxication of being genuinely beloved, that he was not, in the end, exceptional enough to resist what power tends to do to people who hold it for too long without sufficient accountability. And perhaps that is also something Spain needed to learn about itself, that no man, however historic his contributions, however genuine his heroism, however deep his approval ratings, is above the requirement to answer for what he has done. That democracy is not just a gift that is given once by a wise leader and then preserved forever in grateful memory. It is a practice, a daily exercise, a demand made on institutions and individuals alike to be honest, to be accountable, and to tell the truth even when the truth is expensive. The king who saved Spain and then spent decades quietly ransacking the goodwill he had earned in doing so has given his country, in his own strange way, one final lesson in the nature of democratic governance. It turns out the lesson cost more than anyone had bargained for.